Hi everyone, welcome back to Global Semester, where we're all about becoming better cross-cultural representatives of King Jesus, both locally and globally. We've been going through the topic of contextualization. In previous videos, we talked about what contextualization is. We talked about contextualizing the messenger, contextualizing the message, and in the previous video, we talked about contextualizing the believing community. In today's video, we're going to touch on two special concerns in the area of contextualization. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. Please feel free to check out the previous videos on contextualization, as well as the video series on worldview and missional engagement. So we'll get to those two topics right after this. One special concern about contextualization is, what will the believing community look like? Is it going to look like this? Or is it more like this? One is what's known as an elephant church, and the other is what's known as a rabbit church. The comparison is apt because it has many similarities to the animals that they represent. So for example, an elephant matures in 18 years. And there's often only one baby per pregnancy, and an elephant is only fertile 4 times a year. The gestation time for an elephant is about 22 months. And so a family of elephants can grow from 2 to 3 in about 3 years. On the other hand, rabbits mature in 4 months and averages about 7 babies, and is almost always fertile. The gestation time for rabbits is only a month. And so a family can multiply to 470 somewhat million in 3 years. So now as we look at the types of churches, the types of believing communities, perhaps we're more familiar in the West with large churches, or what's known as elephant churches. And oftentimes large churches need funding to maintain the programs, to maintain the building, to maintain the organization of that large church. And pastors are often trained in seminaries where they learn for 2 or 3 years and they come back, be apprenticed, and grow in more training as a pastor. And elephant churches often functions with a bringing in model where people are invited from the outside and brought into the church building. And so the growth of an elephant church is by the process of bringing in. Now, house churches, or rabbit churches in contrast, the families are already there, and the leader of the family is the head of the family, whatever it traditionally might be. And the house churches are maintained by the family, and participants within that house church already have natural affinity groups, whether they're families, extended cousins, friends, or work. And the growth of this rabbit church is by going out and starting new house church groups, where other house church groups are led by the heads of the family. And so as you're crossing culture, it's worth reflecting on what types of churches, what types of believing communities are you wanting to see within that culture? Is it more viable to perpetuate the Western-style church buildings and elephant churches? Or is the culture more conducive to having house churches that are networked to each other or a larger organizing body, which could be an elephant church? And the rabbit church model that is networked with each other is precisely the strategy being employed by church planting movements and disciple-making movements that are experiencing tremendous growth within least reached people groups. So as you're thinking about crossing cultures and going to a least reached people group, it might be worthwhile talking with someone and reflecting on what are the kinds of churches you want to see planted within that indigenous believing community. A second special consideration that came out of discussions and contextualization within a Muslim context is the idea of the contextualization spectrum. Is the believing community going to be more like the culture, or is it going to be foreign to the culture? And here's a chart that delineates this, where C1 is that it's a church that's completely foreign to the Muslim community. So you would picture here a church building with pews, an aisle, a worship band at the front, and a pastor speaking at the front. and likely that they'll be speaking in a foreign language, say English, for example, and that their self-identity of that community is Christian, but then the perception from the outside, or the Muslim perception of that believing community, is that they're Christian and foreign. On the other end of the spectrum, the C6, the believing community is actually not a community. Oftentimes they're segregated or are secret in and of themselves. So privately, they would consider themselves as followers of Jesus or Muslim followers of Jesus. But the Muslim perception of them is that they're still Muslim, even though they're secret believers. So in between is the range between those two poles. And it's the question of what is the believing community's self-identity and what is the outside world's perception, the outside Muslim society's perception of that believing community. To what extent can they contextualize so that they can have a self-identity of Christian and a perceived Muslim identity of a strange sort of Muslim but followers of Isa? But then the issue then becomes, to what extent is it too close to the animistic practices of folk Islam, or even the animistic practices of that culture before Islam came in? And to what extent has that been brought into the Christian community? So syncretism is the concern here. On the other end of the spectrum, the concern is it too foreign? It's too obscure. It has nothing to do with our culture. But it's a foreign culture, and they can do whatever they want because that's their religion, that's their faith. So the issue of contextualization here is, how do you balance the obscurantism, or being perceived as foreign, with syncretism of meshing practices and beliefs of the two together, that it's no longer distinctly Christian, that it's too close to becoming Muslim? And so this takes wisdom from the entire community, not just the foreign international worker, but also the indigenous believing community. The leadership, their pastors, their teachers, and the rest of the community needs to decide what is the line that they need to draw so that they don't fall into, oh, it's too foreign, but oh, it's too similar to traditional beliefs and practices. So while this C1 to C6 spectrum arose out of a discussion in a Muslim or Islamic context, it can actually still be applied to other contexts where there's traditional animistic beliefs, or there's traditional Confucian beliefs, or Buddhist beliefs, or Shintoist practices, or other systems in place within that culture. So it takes both the working of the community, working together in seeking wisdom and understanding, as well as the Holy Spirit leading and guiding that process. And so this process of contextualization, there are ways in which it is, as Jackson Wu calls it, firm, but then there's other ways that also makes it flexible. And so those are just two special concerns within the massive study of contextualization that I wanted to highlight for you, and hopefully getting you to reflect on it and think about it and having your own convictions about them. So if you have any thoughts, questions, or suggestions, write them on the comments below. So until the next video, Shalom v'chesed ve'emet, my friends.